Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome. This podium is very tall, so I hope you can see part of my face. First off, I want to congratulate everyone for making it to the last day of CH23. I hope everyone's been having a good time and that we're feeling good and wide awake this morning, I hope. Also, I wanted to say thank you so much for choosing this session to be the last session of the conference for you all. It is the best session, as we like to say around here. But my name is Jessica. I'm part of the National Right to Housing Network, and I'll be your moderator for today. So before we begin, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. I'll begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, a place that I have called home for the first 18 years of my life, and a place that still holds deep meaning for me and my family. I'd also like to acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors in communities across Mi'kma'ki who came before us to this land. We recognize the ongoing and deep-seated impacts of colonization with a recognition that colonization is not merely history, but a living legacy that continues to affect Indigenous communities across the country to this day. And so when we talk about housing as a human right, which we will momentarily, we are talking about a right that is intrinsically linked to dignity and community, where the right to housing cannot be separated from the rights of the Indigenous peoples who have lived and cared for these lands. So today I encourage you to hold space for this acknowledgement and to recognize it as a necessary step towards reconciliation, a goal that we all must work together towards as a united community. We've got some really great presentations today on the right to housing for you all. I'll introduce our panelists. We've got Ruby Bissett and Emily Parody from the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. We've got Carolyn Witzman, expert researcher from HART. We've got Sahar Raza and Michelle Biss from the National Right to Housing Network. Amazing. So I'll first invite Ruby up for her presentation.
All right. So like Jessica said, my name is Ruby Bissett. I'm a research analyst with the office. Just before we get into the presentation, I'm going to share just a short video. If I can figure out how to do this. Oh, okay. Other way. Okay. Whoa. Sorry, folks. Never used a computer before.
Great.
I actually don't understand what's happening.
I think if we just go
Oh yeah, you can full screen it. Yeah, there you go.
it might work. There we go.
Panic. Okay.
Housing is a fundamental human right. Having a safe and secure place to call home helps people and families thrive and succeed. It is central to human dignity, well-being, and community. But a home is more than just a roof and four walls. It is protection from the elements, and it is a means to access basic services. It also keeps us safe and healthy. The right to housing means many things. For example, it means you're able to get adequate housing that is affordable and meets your needs. It means you can access housing without discrimination or harassment, and you feel safe in your home. It also means your home should be accessible, like if you have a disability or you're an older person. Many people in Canada still live in housing that does not meet these standards, and many do not have a place to live at all. The National Housing Strategy Act recognizes housing as a fundamental human right. It commits governments to focus on those in greatest housing need, to reform housing laws, policies, and programs through a human rights-based approach, and to involve communities in meaningful ways. The Act also establishes a national housing strategy with accountability tools to help develop and maintain the strategy, including the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate. The Federal Housing Advocate's mandate is to promote and protect the right to housing across Canada. The Advocate gives those impacted by housing need and homelessness a voice. The Advocate receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues and uses that information to make recommendations to improve Canada's housing laws, policies, and programs. The Advocate can review the issue. In some cases, they will refer it to the National Housing Council. The Council will establish a review panel to examine the issue more closely and make recommendations. The Advocate doesn't help with individual disputes. If you need help resolving a dispute, you need to go to the Landlord Tenant Board or Human Rights Commission in your province or territory. To make a submission to the Advocate or to find out more about what we do, visit the housing page on the Canadian Human Rights Commission website.
Okay. It's on YouTube. Yeah. It's on the Canadian Human Rights Commission's YouTube page. Yeah. Okay. So this is the Federal Housing Advocate, Marie-Josée Houle. She's the first one in Canada, and she was appointed in February of last year. In all areas of her mandate, the Federal Housing Advocate will take a systemic and participatory approach with a focus on priority groups, which means that the advocate doesn't take on individual cases, but will advocate for changes to laws, policies, and programs that affect the right to housing in Canada. Instead of realizing the right for one person at a time, these changes will improve access to adequate housing for people across the country. And taking a participatory approach means working with individuals and communities directly affected by homelessness and inadequate housing. The work of the Federal Housing Advocate focuses on groups facing systemic disadvantage in housing, and this is guided by the list of priority groups identified in the National Housing Strategy Act. And our office continues to expand this list as well, recognizing that other groups also face disproportionate homelessness and inadequate housing, such as lone parent families, refugee claimants, survivors of trauma, and people in conflict with the law. So I'll give a brief overview of the advocate's mandate. So first, the advocate has a duty to monitor the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing, which includes monitoring the National Housing Strategy. The advocate engages with duty bearers at all levels of government, stakeholders, and rights holders, especially persons with lived experience of housing precarity and homelessness. And our office does this primarily through partnerships with organizations working on the ground in the field and through networks of and collectives of advocates and lived experts. So far, the advocate has visited diverse communities across BC, Saskatchewan, Nunavut, and Labrador, and has plans to visit more parts of the country in the coming year. We also work with academics and experts in the field to conduct research on systemic housing issues, which to date has resulted in a series of reports that we published on financialization, on encampments, some forthcoming research to be published on security of tenure, as well as the research that we'll hear about today, later in this session. The advocate receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues through our online housing submission tool, which can be found on our website. Since its launch in mid-2022, we have received 700 submissions from individuals and organizations. And I'll note that we're still accepting submissions and that there's no deadline to share your experiences and concerns with the advocate. So based on these submissions, research, and engagement, the advocate may decide to review a specific issue or refer it to the National Housing Council for a review panel. If you attended my colleague's session on Wednesday, you'll know that the very first advocate-led systemic review of encampments is currently underway. And concurrently, the very first review panel on the financialization of purpose-built rental is in the midst of holding oral hearings. The advocate also takes other actions on specific issues. She can write letters of concern, and there have been several addressed to mayors across the country on the topic of the human rights of encampment residents. She may write trip reports. An observational report on the trip to BC was recently published, and we can look forward to the report detailing the advocate's visit in Inuit Nunangat to be published in very short order. She can also make recommendations in her annual report to the Minister of Housing, Communities and Infrastructure, and 2 such reports have been submitted since the beginning of her mandate. The advocate's main vehicle for promoting change is through recommendations to the minister responsible for housing, the federal minister. They have an obligation to table the advocate's annual reports in Parliament and to respond to all of her recommendations. While the advocate may make recommendations to other levels of government, the federal minister is the only one with a duty to respond. So given this mandate to monitor the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing, it's important we understand what progressive realization means. It means that governments must adopt immediate, concrete measures, apply all appropriate means, including policies and legislation, invest the maximum available resources, prioritize the needs of marginalized and vulnerable groups, urgently address immediate threats to human dignity, such as homelessness and forced eviction, ensure non-discrimination and avoid retrogression, and progressively establish realization of the right in the shortest time possible. So while the National Housing Strategy was released in 2017, the National Housing Strategy Act came later in 2019, enshrining the human right to housing in domestic law. Under the Act, the National Housing Strategy must set out a long-term vision for housing in Canada that recognizes the importance of housing in achieving social, economic, health, and environmental goals, establish national goals relating to housing and homelessness, and identify related priorities, initiatives, timelines, and desired outcomes, focus on improving housing outcomes for persons in greatest need, and provide for participatory processes to ensure the ongoing inclusion and engagement of civil society, stakeholders, vulnerable groups, and persons with lived experience of housing need, as well as those with lived experience of homelessness. And we'll see through our presentation how the strategy is holding up to those requirements. And I'll invite my colleague Emily up to talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Ruby. One quick note, I'm just going to jump back to that National Housing Strategy requirement slide for a second, because I think a really key piece of information is that this act requires every government of Canada to always have a national housing strategy in place, and that the goal of that national housing strategy must always be to advance the realization of the right to adequate housing. And any strategy passed by any government of Canada has to fulfill these requirements. So I know that often one of the key problems that we all face in terms of housing policy is that policies can often change with change of government, whether at the federal, provincial, territorial, or municipal level. But what this act does is it enshrines a national housing strategy as a permanent, ongoing requirement, no matter who's in power. So just keep that in mind in your interactions with the federal government now and in the future. So how's the National Housing Strategy doing so far in relationship to its own targets and timelines, as well as in relationship to the requirements set out by the Act? The answer's meh, basically. So it started out with very ambitious targets, and it's important to acknowledge that the passage of this strategy in 2017 and its implementation in 2018 marked a very welcome return of the federal government to meaningful engagement in housing policy after a 25-year abdication of its human rights responsibilities with regards to housing. So, thumbs up for that. It's also really, really significant investment and suite of programs. It started out, I think when they first published the document, I don't know if, other policy wonks in the room might correct me, were they saying it was 39 billion? Were they saying it was 40 billion? Something in that neighborhood. And it just keeps growing and growing as they add programs and add allocations. So it's currently valued The last number we have is 82 billion plus. I recently saw a parliamentary report that said that it was $89 billion. So it's a really, really significant, important investment. And when it was first passed in 2017, it committed to a human rights-based approach to housing. It also embedded requirements around GBA plus, around climate targets, and around accessibility targets into housing policy. So again, thumbs up, fantastic, really important understanding of the intersection of housing at kind of the center of issues of equity, issues of health, issues of accessibility, and climate issues. And it launched or incorporated a suite of programs. So Reaching Home, the program that probably most people in this room are most familiar with, is now part of the National Housing Strategy. It launched distinctions-based Indigenous housing strategies with Inuit, Métis, and First Nations governing entities. It established federally funded capital programs for building new housing and repairing existing housing, and those are the biggest investment of the entire strategy. It established a framework agreement with all provinces and territories around housing that also embeds the human rights-based approach, and bilateral cost-shared programs with provinces and territories, including, most importantly, the Canada Housing Benefit, that it has been a source of funding for provincial, territorial, and municipal housing supplement programs that I'm sure many folks in this room have relied on to rehouse people out of shelters or to prevent evictions. And the shining star, I would say, of the National Housing Strategy is the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is the only program that I would say really reflects the kind of urgency that's required to address homelessness. It was a new program introduced during the pandemic. It includes full capital funding, full grant funding for nonprofits that are building rapid housing, with a focus on those in greatest and immediate need of housing. And it has far exceeded its targets. So I think it's on track to deliver more than 10,000 new units of housing in a really short time. Unfortunately, that program has not been made permanent. And so, you know, we're all kind of hopefully waiting for an announcement of Rapid Housing Initiative 4, because I think that's the one that has really shown the most success in addressing homelessness. So the 2017 targets of the National Housing Strategy were, okay, in the initial document, it said to reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. But it's very important to note that that was later amended to a commitment to eliminate chronic homelessness. It aimed to take 530,000 households out of core housing need, which means households who are living in housing that is either unaffordable, unsuitable, or in inadequate condition, or a combination of those three things. So it aimed to ensure that about half of the households in core housing need in Canada have their housing needs addressed. And it aimed to create 100,000 new homes and repair 300,000 homes. So very big targets and exciting numbers, not enough to eliminate the housing crisis, but really important in terms of making progress. Unfortunately, by 2022, its progress on those priorities was really, really limited. So some key kind of shortcomings of the strategy at the 5-year mark. Probably most importantly, it failed to address urban, rural, and northern Indigenous homelessness. So there was no dedicated programs to address the needs of the 80% of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who live in urban and rural centers, and Margaret Foe spoke to that a couple days ago. studies have shown that for the big federal capital programs that are like the biggest money drivers of the strategy, only 1 in 20 of the homes those programs create would actually be affordable to households in core housing need. And a very small number are also affordable and accessible to the various priority groups that are named in the strategy, such as single-parent-led households, seniors, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, new immigrants and refugees, members of Black and racialized communities, and other groups with particular housing needs. The Auditor General's report on chronic homelessness in 2022, after an exhaustive review of the National Housing Strategy, concluded that there was no measurable impact of the strategy on chronic homelessness. This is a real shortcoming. A key piece of that finding was just a lack of coordinated evaluation and tracking of the impacts of National Housing Strategy programs on chronic homelessness. So in part, it was a finding that it can't be measured, but also, given the other failings that we're talking about, it's pretty clear to see that the strategy is not meeting the needs of people experiencing either visible or hidden homelessness. Another real problem with the strategy is it uses inconsistent definitions of affordable housing. So when it was first passed, a lot of folks understandably figured, oh, the federal government's getting back into housing. In 1993, what they did is they canceled federal housing programs that funded social housing, public housing, co-op housing, and other forms of nonprofit housing. So I think a lot of us just inserted the word social housing when really what they said was affordable housing. Unfortunately, the way that the strategy has tended to define that is a certain number of units in private market developments that reach affordability criteria that are defined in all kinds of different ways, none of which are actually affordable to people in greatest need. And finally, and most importantly, that strategy has yet to be updated to fulfill the requirements of the National Housing Strategy Act. So we have this human rights legislation. All housing policy in Canada needs to advance us towards realizing that right, the first point of which is to eliminate homelessness. But yet, no one's kind of looked back at the strategy to see, okay, well, how do we make it line up with that? So given her role of monitoring the National Housing Strategy, one of the advocate's first acts when she took up her role in February of 2022 was to make some calls to action on the National Housing Strategy and improvements that were urgently, immediately needed for it to align with its requirements under the Act. So she called for it to address Canada's legacy of colonialism and ensure that adequate housing is provided for Indigenous peoples no matter where they live, whether on community or in urban, rural, and northern areas. She called for the programs of the strategy to be reviewed and revised so that they were actually purpose-built to deliver the kind of housing that is needed to address the housing crisis. Whereas what we see in the strategy is kind of a disconnect of targets from policies. If they've got these removing households from core housing need targets, but none of the programs that have put it in place are actually designed to remove households from core housing needs. So we need to see that connection made a lot better. And we need the data to be collected to track the real results of those programs. She also called for the strategy to prioritize the development and the repair and acquisition of housing that is permanently affordable and that provides community value. in other words, non-market forms of housing community, land trust, Indigenous housing, co-ops, and social housing. And finally, the strategy has to demonstrate the leadership role of the federal government. And a really important key piece of a human rights framework is that the federal level of government has a leadership role to play with subnational governments or other orders of government. So they have to use the tools they have, the funding tools, the policy and legislative tools to guide and incentivize and drive action towards realizing the right to housing at all levels of government. So for this year's National Right to Housing Day campaign, the advocate is focusing on that recommendation on non-market housing. And she's calling for, again, the revision of the National Housing Strategy to prioritize the development and acquisition of non-market housing supply that's permanently affordable and that provides community value. Now, we've heard a lot of talk about housing supply as the solution to the housing crisis. And unfortunately, to date, the new supply that's been funded by the National Housing Strategy and a lot of the new supply that's the result of these big kind of housing supply reports and pushes that we're seeing at the provincial level. I'm in Ontario, so I'm aware that Ontario has a housing supply plan. But that housing supply is not the supply that we need. It is not the supply that's going to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness and people in core housing need. So essentially, non-market housing supply is the best investment for this $82 billion strategy. It's the one that's going to remain affordable in perpetuity. It's the one that's going to be kind of purpose-built and purpose-developed to meet the needs of specific communities. It's going to remain as a community asset and in community hands. And I think if we just think about the social housing and co-op housing, for example, that was built with federal support back in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, all of that is still among the most affordable housing in Canada, and it is still providing permanent, secure homes. So essentially, a human rights-based approach requires that public funds be used for public good. Now, CMHC in 2022 released a report that has gotten a lot of attention and that has kind of defined a lot of the discussion about housing in Canada. It found that, I'm going to get the number wrong, 5.8 million new units are needed by 2032. I'm not exactly sure. It was like a really big, scary number with an 8 or 10 year deadline to restore affordability in Canada. But unfortunately, there were really important gaps in that report. And Carolyn presented about these gaps on Wednesday, so some of you may have heard her really fulsome analysis of what the problems were. I'm not going to go into detail. You can view her presentation virtually. But I will just note that the focus of the report was on measuring housing demand and how much housing would be needed to fulfill that demand. And the housing demand that was being measured included investor demand. It included, people leveraging the equity in the house they own to buy second, third, fourth units as investment properties. It included the kind of demand that is driving the construction of teeny tiny studio condos in our cities that aren't adequate for families to live in. It also only focused on ownership housing. So the idea of restoring affordability to Canada's housing system was entirely focused on making the price of a house to buy closer in line with average incomes. So again, no attention to renters, no attention to people experiencing homelessness. Its definition of what constitutes affordable was not human rights-based. It was not consistent with CMHC's own definition of 30% of income should be spent on housing costs. And it ignores other components of the right to adequate housing, such as the safety of housing, whether it's in a location that's appropriate for people, whether it's the right size for the household, whether it's accessible for residents with disabilities. It doesn't speak to any of that. And it has a really unclear relationship to the National Housing Strategy targets, and it doesn't reflect Canada's obligations under the National Housing Strategy Act. So given these problems, the advocate wanted to try to generate a different model of estimating Canada's housing supply shortages, one that was based in human rights. And so we worked with Carolyn Weitzman to produce that estimate, which also generated big, scary numbers and also, is going to be really challenging to achieve, but at least it actually measures what kind of housing supply is needed to end homelessness and ensure that everyone has an adequate place to live. So the principles of a rights-based calculation of housing supply needs are, you start with who needs what housing where and what can they afford to pay. That has to be the starting point. You can't design housing policy without that fundamental basis. It has to focus on households in core housing need and the groups that are left out even of the calculation of core housing needs, such as people experiencing homelessness, people who are doubled up with friends and family, students who are living in inadequate housing, other groups who I can't, thank you, people living in congregate housing, thank you, Carolyn, exactly. And then you also have to consider two concepts that I'll let Carolyn speak to if she wants to: suppressed household formation, which is basically people who are still living with their parents or still living with roommates because they can't afford to live on their own, and variations in local demand. And you have to then break that down by income category, household size, and priority population, all of which Carolyn and the HEART Project have done. And you have to think about projected population growth. So with that as the foundation, Carolyn estimated Canada's housing supply needs, but she's also going to now speak to what types of policies and programs are necessary for us to get there, and particularly how the National Housing Strategy could be retooled to actually get us to the point that it needs to be at. So I'll hand it over to you. Yes, let's see. Whoops. Nope. Do you see yourself here on this desktop anywhere? I see coordinated access.
No, I don't see it.
Reframing things.
Was it on the web browser, maybe?
Is it on, are the presentations on the browser? Sorry, folks. Enjoy this little intermission. We should play you some music.
Did you download it as a file onto the computer, or was it?
You sent it in.
Is that coordinated access one? Oh, no, was it? I think we're going to use that later.
Oh, yeah.
Nope. The back end. Oh, I guess. I think I
Sorry, folks.
Yeah, because it'll show me that way.
I have it. Okay. Let's just do that. How many housing policy experts does it take to queue up
You know what,
a
this is happening a
slideshow?
lot this session, so there's technical glitches, and even the app itself is glitching in the building, so it's not you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's a systemic problem, not an individual fault. Is that what you're saying?
It is. I just wanted to take a moment that some of my other friends that couldn't attend because of the cost of attending, plug me every night for what's going on, what's being said. Sorry, I thought my old teacher voice was still holding up, but sorry, I'm just gonna entertain you all. No, gonna give my big fat opinion, sorry, whilst you try and get that going. But the friends that couldn't be here and afford to be here, plug me every night, what's going on, what's being said. And so just one of the things I wanted to briefly say is we did some math crunching. And so the housing minister, and this speaks to some of the things spoken now and in the keynote today, he had a big gap because he talked about, let's give developers more money.
Closer, you just need to stay a little more this way and just talk closer to the mic.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Ooh. So he talked about giving developers more money, more incentives, more exemptions. He talked about the Prime Minister and WEF and other people talking about this universal basic income. We looked at the math last night, okay? So we're saying there's this money need to make these things happen. So universal basic income, they kind of tested it with the CERB payments, $2,000 a month. That's $24,000 a year. 2 years ago, our population was over 38 million, so 40 million. That is almost half our annual GDP. We're talking $960 trillion. What? We did the math. You don't believe me? Do the math yourself. So if they have the money to talk universal basic income, why don't they have the money to fix this? Okay, and I'm running into immigrants all the time because of the area I live in, almost every day. So they know I'm going to the conference, and every day they're saying they want these answers. A lot of them were recruited here, and we know our governments are still aggressively recruiting these immigrants, so they're getting the shaft too. And we've got a 31% exodus now that they're trying to find other places because they're being brought here, and it's not affordable. Okay, they're sharing rooms. These engineers and doctors that were brought here sharing room in the HRM, and I know across Canada, $1,000 a month for a room. A room. That is criminal. And another thing, I am spiritual, and I heard somebody say, they said evil yesterday about comments and stuff, but there's evil in this politeness, that there's that gap that he didn't talk about the housing stock we have, that in 2021, there was that scathing commission that said they've lost track of thousands and thousands of the condition in units. So why aren't we handling what we already have instead of talking about giving more money to developers or somehow having almost half our GDP to create universal basic income is not adding up. Okay, sorry, you look like you're ready to go.
I'm actually going to be talking about GDP. Thanks very much. I'm going to try to give you some hope. Canada's done some awful things in the past. It's also done some really cool things around housing in the past. Other countries have successfully addressed housing shortages. There's things to learn from the past. There's things to learn about other places. I'm going to be talking about that today. If I can go to the next slide. So Emily and Ruby have already eloquently talked about the principles we're talking about here. Adequate housing, and that means not only affordable housing and housing in decent condition and not overcrowded housing, but it also means accessibility for people with disabilities, security of tenure, well located so that you don't have that concern about your work-life balance. You're not on a bus for an hour a day each way. Cultural adequacy, and really some of the most powerful presentations I've been at this conference are about Indigenous culturally based healing. So adequate housing is a basis, and we have measures out there internationally. We haven't necessarily adopted them nationally. the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. And I want to warn people, especially those of you who were at my presentation 2 days ago, that it has taken 3 to 4 decades to get in the mess that we're in. It's going to take 3 decades, optimistically, to get us out of it. Because we've had this policy neglect, and infrastructure doesn't happen overnight. You want to build a rope bridge, maybe you can do that overnight. If you want to build a bridge that actually can safely move people, it takes a while. Emphasis on the rights and the voices of those who are most marginalized. So again, Emily's talked a little bit about what has been included and what hasn't been included when you talk about an aggregate supply approach. You have to keep in mind that Indigenous people, I know you all do, government needs to keep in mind that Indigenous people are multiple times more likely to be experiencing homelessness, that the single highest risk group across Canada to be in core housing need are single mothers, that racialized households have been systemically excluded, and that people with different abilities have been systemically excluded. And again, as Emily said, we need to have not just housing targets, but income-based targets that are based on maximum affordable rents and coordination or maximal affordable housing costs between all levels of government. I was told not to exclude home ownership, although certainly the economy does. And at one of the core principles is the need for immediate unreserved funding for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing and land back. Because it's vital for Indigenous people to define, develop, and manage culturally adequate housing, preferably on Indigenous-owned land. And we're seeing some experiments, some progress in Winnipeg and in Vancouver and even in my hometown of Ottawa about this, but there needs to be so much more. So for those of you who saw my earlier presentation at the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project that I work with, it's based at UBC, heart.ubc.ca. We use 5 income categories, and they fit in with what the CMHC used to use to talk about affordable housing. So there's a low-income category, and we've had to add, unfortunately, a very low-income category that has people on fixed income as well as low income who are generally reliant on minimum wage. And just a stat, I have too many in my head, I'll throw one out. About 25% of Canadian workers earn within $3 of minimum wage, so that's a lot of people. Moderate income people who have traditionally been part of the focus of housing policy, so up to 80%, but at this point there's no rental, and there's maybe 4 cities in Quebec where rent is affordable for moderate income people who need more than a 1-bedroom. Median income, middle income people, those are the only people who can apply now for Habitat for Humanity and some other affordable housing initiatives. And in many cities, rent is not affordable to middle income households. And finally, high income households. In core housing need, there's 1.45 million households, and 77% of those in core housing need are low income. But for those of you who missed my presentation 2 days ago, core housing need excludes homeless people because they don't have a home. It excludes students because they're considered temporary and voluntary state. It includes anyone in congregate housing, so if you don't have your own entrance, if you're in a group home or in long-term care, you're not included. It excludes farm workers. It excludes many other folks as well. So how do we best meet the need of at least 300,000 very low-income people, many, not all, who have high support needs, who are homeless, or as we heard this morning, at imminent risk of homelessness? How do we address the needs of at least 300,000 inadequately housed single mother-led families, this is an existing deficit, who can't stay in a studio or a one-bedroom, not comfortably. Quite often they're excluded from it, even if that's all that they can afford. How can we meet the needs of 1.4 million students at the minimum who are ignored, but they exist, and they crowd out the low rent, they are part of the low rent market? How do we meet the needs of 700,000 people in congregate housing, long-term care, overcrowded, unsafe, group homes? I know so many parents my age, boomers, who are still taking care of their children with disability or their parents with disability because there aren't other alternatives. And their biggest worry is that they die and they leave their child or their parent homeless. How do we meet the needs of 1 million other low-income households? And also, how do we meet the need of up to 2 million moderate-income households, seniors who are aging in place? Again, as we heard this morning, in big places, but they can't afford to move out into a smaller place or a rental place in their community. Families that are priced out of large cities and either decide not to have children, or they're dealing with extremely long commutes and also environmentally unsound commutes. Those who are doubling up involuntarily with roommates or their adults living with parents. I'm sure we all know these folks, especially in our work. So the bottom line is that we need, at least in the next decade, 4 million very low and low-cost rental homes under 1,050, using 2021 numbers, you'd adjust it for inflation, and universal basic income, and at least tripling welfare rates, which haven't increased with inflation since the 1990s, and doubling minimum wage. That's what's needed in this rich country we call Canada. We need also at least 2 million rental homes that cost between $1,000 and $2,500, again adjusted for inflation. And that means the market can't do this. I've asked developers, I work with developers. Developers aren't necessarily evil people, whether they're non-market or market. They cannot provide this housing. So absolutely, there's the need to, in a first instance, double supply of non-market, and that can happen through new homes, through acquired homes, through subdivided homes. I'm not saying that we need to pave over every green space. And then we need to move towards a universe where a third of housing supply is non-market towards a target of 20% of all homes. And I want to tell you, and I'll tell you in this presentation, you may call me a dreamer. I am not the only one. This was recommended in 1944 in Canada. This is happening right now in France, in Denmark, in Finland, in Austria, even in Germany, which downloaded a lot, got rid of a lot of homes after reunification, non-market homes. They're suddenly going, ooh, mistake. Okay, so I'm going to go very quickly through that. The NHS midway evaluation, whether it's 82 or 89 million, it's a shed load of money, and it's not producing what we need. Absolutely, Canada has an aggregate supply problem. Canada is building fewer homes than it did in the early 1970s. We have over twice as many people. But unpack that, and you find that purpose-built rental fell off a cliff in 1972 and never quite recovered from a series of tax incentives to support affordable rental, coupled with capital gains tax was brought in with an exemption for principal residents, so that helped home speculation, certainly of homeowners, and just a passel of things that happened negative. In 1972, condos became legal. I could go on. 72 was a good year for social housing, bad year for purpose-built rental, and good year for housing speculation. But what really fell off a cliff in the late 80s going into the early 1990s was non-market. You can see this really starkly in this chart from Brian Clifford. In the early 70s, up to 25% of all home completions were non-market. In the early 80s, 20% of all home completions were non-market. We've done it. We can do it again. So I want to talk about 3 potential game changers. One of them, which we've already alluded to, are ambitious targets and a renewed NHS. It's a 10-year program. Lots of policies take a 5-year stop and assess. There were a lot of very damning reports at the halfway point this year. There's talk of, and there wasn't talk in 2017, of building 5.8 million new homes. I have no problem with that. But can it include doubling non-market housing, and as I say, towards a goal of eventually it being a third of new construction? Yeah, I'm going to say it, because it was said 80 years ago in Canada. So what, have we gotten smarter? No. Okay. Scaling up well-located affordable housing. And one of the keys in every country where it works, including past Canada, is government land for non-market housing. And absolutely the kind of zoning changes that are happening now and building code changes that enable affordable purpose-built rental apartments, market and non-market, with a focus on smaller apartment buildings with larger apartments for those who need them. Absolutely, we now have 2 provinces with an acquisition strategy, BC and Nova Scotia, but we need federal and provincial acquisition strategy to stop the hemorrhage of cheap rental housing. And we need to build in tenant protections against evictions and unsustainable rents. And as you saw, there is a huge upswing in public opinion for it. We've done it before. Canada told, well, voluntold all the provinces, just like they're doing with cities now around zoning in 75, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if you brought in rent control? And they did. All of them did. In 1942, Canada, during the wartime, said, we don't want, the Canadian government used to talk like this. They said, we don't want profiteering, landlord profiteering during a war. And they created national rent control, which lasted until 1949. So, ambitious targets, scaling up, well-located affordable housing, and of course finance. So there needs to be a purpose-built non-market housing fund with guaranteed long-term low-rate mortgages, and that will fund a lot of moderate income housing. But then you need grants, as there are with the Rapid Housing Initiative for deep affordability, or a lot of ongoing deeply targeted housing subsidy or ongoing operating subsidy. It's debt or deficit or death, really. 6 million homes is possible. Canada built well over 1 million homes for heroes between 43 and 60 on government land for low and moderate income households. The houses were built and then sold for about $2,000-3,000, which was the equivalent of low end of moderate income. That's the equivalent of 6 million homes today. Sweden built 1 million homes, 65 to 74 on government land for low to median income households. If you put that in Canadian terms, current day Canadian terms, like it was 6.5 million people in Sweden then, that's equivalent to 6 million homes today in Canada. Singapore, right after independence from colonialism, built 147 homes over the same time period, 66 to 76, on government land for low to median income homes. And that, for the population of Singapore, right after independence, when it was a poor country, was equivalent to 6 million homes today, and that's part of what made it one of the richest countries in Asia today. All of those countries had less money than today. All of them use scale. All of them used modular, standardized design. In fact, IKEA was a big beneficiary of the Million Homes program in Sweden, and that maximized labor productivity, and it maximized well-located housing because it was located near transport. Well, in the case of Sweden and Singapore and Canada, put its bed in cars. Today, Canada is building about 1,000 non-market homes per year. It's building a little bit more if you count subsidized market homes that have limited affordability covenants. Austria is building, in Canadian population terms, 72,000 a year. It's had, Vienna has had a wonderful program for 100 years. And they spend less, like a lot less, you'll see in a minute, of their GDP on housing than Canada does. Denmark's only building 17,000, but another 40,000 are getting deep energy renovation without rents going up. And that would be the equivalent of 250,000 Canadian homes. Finland, little Finland, is building the Canadian equivalent of 62,000 homes a year. I could go on. There are other countries that are doing better. We should learn from them. We should stop looking south to the US or across to our colonial mom, England, and look at places that are working. Since the year 2000, France has had mandatory sub-targets on social housing for all municipalities. And they have a 3-tier program. They have regions, cities, the national government. They used to rely on the regional government. They went, oh, you suck, you're doing a terrible job. So the national government kind of took over, and there were fines, and indeed, in some cases, the national government's taken over planning. And then it was increased to 25%. In Paris, it's 30% social housing. Combination of acquisitions, non-market, great financing guaranteed by the French state. Hamburg, again, I mentioned that Germany's changing its tune in the last few years, and it's pretty dramatic. So they have a rule of thirds. Municipalities sign multi-year agreements with development industry associations, and they build, but they don't develop, a third nonprofit, a third regulated rental, and a third market ownership. So land is maybe the most important component of cost, particularly in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, but really all big cities have very expensive land. And this isn't me, this is McKinsey looking at an international report a few years ago. A report in Vancouver showed that actually the biggest cost difference could be if government land is leased for nonprofit housing, and that could be close to a 40% discount on the cost of housing. And it would create, without any other subsidy, grant, financing, et cetera, at least in 2019, moderate income affordability in Vancouver, which is the highest most expensive market in Canada. Talk a moment about planning and zoning. So we're starting to see, not fast enough, exclusionary zoning, which was racist and classist and heteronormative. I don't know where to begin with zoning. It needs to be turned on its head. And in Portland, they actually have turned it on its head. They've restricted the maximum size of new single-family homes. They've banned monster homes in most neighborhoods. In fact, they're talking about banning new detached single-family homes in a city with affordability problems like Portland. We're starting to talk about eliminating minimum parking restrictions, which can add up to $47,000 per stall if it's underground, along with design trivia like setbacks. We're starting to talk about minimum as of right building heights, and don't fool yourselves, that helps nonprofits most because NIMBYs hate market housing the most. And then there's a whole gradation where if you're housing people who, for instance, have been incarcerated previously, that's like the NIMBY complete have a stroke. But it's bad all over. And NIMBY is not democratic, it's anti-democratic. Get rid of it. Okay. A number of cities have been looking at density bonuses for nonprofit or 100% affordable homes. So if there were 4 to 6 stories in all residential and mixed-use areas, 8 to 12 stories within a radius of public transit stops, and 20 to 30 stories within 200 meters of a designated major transit station area, BC's starting to talk about that, and that's going to be a big enabler of lower costs. Helsinki, a lovely city. Population 650,000, similar to Vancouver. What you'll find in a couple of the examples I'm going to give is that governments don't, it's like Naomi Campbell, they don't get up in the morning for less than 1,000 units, you know, like none of this 30-unit bull, you know? So this is a former port area developed by the city of Helsinki. It's got 10,000 homes in it. Again, rule of thirds, a third non-market, third regulated rental, a third ownership. It also has 8,000 workplaces. It has these amazing student residences. It has amazing supportive housing provided by the 4th largest landlord in Finland, the Y Foundation. They're coming to Ottawa in January. 17,000 supportive homes from the Y Foundation. We have to start thinking like that. Aspern-Seestadt in Vienna, population 2 million, similar to Montreal. They've taken a former airport, a bit like Downsview, say, in Toronto, 10,000 homes, 12,000 workplaces, 2/3 of them non-market. There's already, I went there, it's just starting to be built. They've already got a train station, they've already got rapid buses. This is a walkable community in a suburban area. And they have these amazing architecture exhibits where they go, women-friendly housing, go. Age-friendly housing, tell me what you can do, and if you win, you can build it. Like really amazing equity-focused policy. Freiham, a suburb of Munich, 1.5 million, similar to Canada. Yes, greenfield, but 8,000 homes and 12,000 workplaces, including a new university campus, 50% non-market. First thing that went in was 3 train stations. I've been to La Caserne de Relais in Paris. 2 million people in a region of 9 million, similar to Toronto. 30%, actually, this is 100% non-market housing, but the target in Paris is 30% non-market. Former military barracks, so federal land. It's 5 minutes from the metro. It's in a quite ritzy area. It's got 600 homes, plus a childcare center, cafes, and this gorgeous public park in the middle. These are beautiful pearls in the cityscape. This isn't cheap public housing as, you know, the stereotype is. This is gorgeous stuff. But let's go back in history a bit. St. Lawrence in Toronto developed in the 70s and 80s. 4,000 homes, 3 schools, a community center, a supermarket, a farmer's market, a bar, church, restaurants, a linear park, a third public housing, a third co-op, a third condos. Believe it or not, I still remember, because I'm old, people coming from all over the world to St. Lawrence neighborhood and saying, can we be like the Canadians? More recently, Fraserview in Vancouver, 1,000 homes, all non-market, enabled through the BC Community Land Trust, includes a supportive housing component. Broke ground in 2018, built by 2022. You can build quickly if it's government-owned land and it's pre-zoned and it has a non-market developer who's good at development. It can happen. Beaver Barracks in Ottawa, former barracks, just like Caserne de Relais, sold not given away, by the federal government to Ottawa, then leased to a nonprofit developer. It's a small site, it's a city block, 254 affordable non-market rental homes in 5 buildings, plus fire hall and, ambulance and offices, and it has district heating, and it was a finalist in the World Habitat Awards. It got built through a remarkable story, and I think Ray's can tell about it. He's in the audience. In Montreal, the old Blue Bonnets racecourse, which I remember very clearly from my childhood, a big project. Hopefully, the City of Montreal is a developer. Like to see, I'm looking forward to it happening. We talk a bit about acquisitions. Over 550,000 unsubsidized units renting below $750 were lost between 2011 and 2021. Toronto and Montreal, as well as BC and Nova Scotia, all have relatively new acquisition strategies. That has to be a priority. It can happen. We've talked a bit about federal financing. $26 billion in loan, mostly to private developers, $13 billion in grants and loans, but most have been spent on repairs, not new housing, just because the state of a lot of social housing is in bad shape. Compare that to the Rapid Housing Initiative, which is the only program that's focused on homelessness and core housing need, and the only program, unlike the 2 previous, that doesn't have stable funding. So an absolute priority has to be a 4th round of the Rapid Housing Initiative. Let's look at the bottom line. Canada's not very good at statistics. I think that's come up before, but all told, at least by the calculations that I did using Parliamentary Budget Office, it's about 0.6% of the GDP spent on non-market. France and Finland, which I've already talked about, spend 1% of their GDP on non-market housing. Germany's spending more, but it's sort of catching up after unfortunately selling a lot. Austria's spending a lot less because it has a long, strong history of social housing and knows how it's done. Provinces are a very important part of the financing. As many of us know, they haven't been ponying up enough money to fund the support of housing, the housing supports and Rapid Housing Initiative. It wasn't even in the bilateral agreements. That's a problem. Provincial lands being sold off to private developers with no requirement for social or affordable housing. In Ontario, they're committed to scaling up for-profit long-term care, despite COVID deaths being 3 times greater in privately provided long-term care. They don't provide rent control for new build, and they have vacancy control, despite 20% rent increases year on year. My point of bringing this up is that absolutely needs to be part of federal agreements in the next round of bilateral agreements. As for municipal financing needs to rely less on development contributions, which shift the financing burden to renters and homeowners in new construction, including inclusionary zoning, and more on property tax, which is a wealth tax, and unlike income tax, isn't progressive. You don't have to pay more if you have a $3 million home. And it doesn't sufficiently recognize the windfall gains in home values, which also aren't captured through capital gains. There are many countries that have progressive property taxes. BC used to have land value tax that looked at the underlying value of the land. And that doesn't mean, when I say property tax should go up, which it should, and it also should stop being unequal because apartment buildings often pay higher rates than single-family homes. The cities should continue to offer property tax deferrals to low-income owners, but then they can recoup some of the amount. So the summary of government roles: the federal government's there to do leadership, good data, and infrastructure funding, because housing is infrastructure, and we need a new generation of affordable, accessible, and sustainable supply. The provincial government needs to offer tenant protection, including eviction prevention and rent regulation, as well as adequate welfare to reduce poverty and homelessness, and health and social supports for those who need them. And the municipality has to focus on planning approvals as of right for non-market housing and coordination of local efforts. My last slide, what does it look like when it's fixed? It's really important to start from that point. Functional zero homelessness with sufficient and culturally adequate supportive housing, including for Indigenous people. Steady decreases in core housing need towards zero. Doubling nonprofit housing as a start, and then a 20% target. At least 1 in 5 should be family-sized 3+ bedroom homes at a range of price points throughout the city. 15-minute cities where you don't have to rely on a car. Urban land banks sufficient to meet Indigenous housing need. And last but not least, median house prices, which was the focus of the CMHC report last year, being 3 times area median household income. We had that in the 70s, we had that until the 1980s. Now house prices would have to go down to 1/3 of what they are across Canada to be affordable to middle-income people. They'd need to go down to 1/4 of what they are in Toronto, 1/5 of what they are in Vancouver. We need to look at safe, secure, stable rental for all of us. Thank you.
There we go.
Yeah. Your turn. Oh, hi everyone. Thank you, Carolyn, for that fantastic presentation. I think when we were talking about what Sahar and I would be doing, I think we were told something like, can you guys bring some fun to the end of this? So that's our goal. It's Friday. We're at the end of the conference. Some of you are like, when can I check into my plane? When can I go? So we promise we're going to give you 10 minutes maybe of some exciting advocacy stuff to keep your eyes out on. And I'm going to ask everyone, I'm feeling really squirmy, so maybe this is just for me, but if you could stretch your arms a little bit, take a deep breath. Yeah, that's gonna get some yawns out potentially. Woo! Okay, so Sahar and I are gonna speak a little bit to some cool advocacy stuff. And then if our technology works, there's this really cool hip app. My colleagues are laughing at me because I'm the senior on the team. But there's a cool app we're going to try to use to maybe generate some conversation and also see if folks want to take the mic for a little bit too. So the first thing that I think I'm talking about is the review panel process. So I think that Emily and Ruby talked about it maybe a little bit in their presentation. Yeah, mentioned it. One thing that the National Housing Strategy Act gave us that's hugely exciting is this mechanism called review panels. The idea behind these review panels is that you can participate in an oral and written hearing process on systemic violations of the right to housing. I just said that in a very boring way, but trust me, it's so cool. What it is it's an opportunity to shed light on violations of the right to housing. It's an opportunity to have your voice heard and have recommendations come out of a process that are really rooted in legal fundamental rights. And so right now there's a process going on about the financialization of purpose-built rental housing, hugely connected to what we just talked about now within the National Housing Strategy, because as was mentioned, so many of the programs in the National Housing Strategy have focused on housing stock that isn't actually affordable, that isn't actually aimed at ending homelessness or core housing need, that is really just driving speculation. So there's a process going on right now. you can get in touch with us to be part of that process. And for many of us in the room to know too, there's another review panel, an open hearing process coming up in the new year on women's homelessness, in particular Indigenous women and girls' homelessness. So you can totally get in touch with us if you're interested in that. And then Sahar is going to speak to the next point.
Sure. Yeah, so just to build on what Michelle raised, and it also builds on the keynote we heard at lunch, some of the key takeaways that we've heard from this review panel process thus far that I think a lot of folks will really resonate with: recurring calls for rent and vacancy control. I think to stop the bleeding of affordability, we just need to rein in rents. They are going up at astronomical rates and incomes are not keeping up. We've heard it across the conference, and as our colleagues mentioned, there is a role that the federal government plays in demonstrating leadership, and so we are consistently trying to get them to use their funding power and their federal power with other levels of government to actually demonstrate that leadership and make human rights real. And so that's a huge call to action that we're working towards constantly, and it has come up in the review panel. Another major piece is to ensure that all funding out of these national housing strategy programs have human rights criteria. So not just affordability, as we've discussed, there's accessibility, there's cultural appropriateness. And as Carolyn mentioned, some of the most powerful presentations we've heard this week were from our Indigenous brothers and sisters telling us about how colonial some of our ways of thinking in the sector can be at times. So we have been advocating for that, and that came up in the review panel. And then, of course, a major call to scale up non-market housing. And so to that end, I believe Emily introduced our National Housing Day event that's coming up on November 22nd. The Federal Housing Advocate will be convening a conversation specifically about how we can practically set up the non-market housing sector for success. And on that day, there's also a community-based campaign launching called the Social Housing and Human Rights Campaign, where folks are calling for the federal government to massively invest in social housing. And so I'm telling you all of this so that you know, social. I'm telling you all of this because these are opportunities for folks to get involved. It's not just something to know about, but you can write to your MPs and so on. And so a little plug for our network, we have a great newsletter. If you go to housingrights.ca and register, we are always pumping out opportunities to get engaged. If it's low barrier, just attending a webinar, or if you want to get more involved in working groups and advocacy, we know you're all passionate, so yeah, please join us. And I'll pass it back.
Okay, so now is the moment where I'm gonna show off how hip I am by, hey. Okay, I'm gonna make a very middle class assumption and assume that most of the folks in the room have a phone. I know. So I'm gonna ask you to pull out your phone, and we've got still about 8 minutes, I'm gonna say we have 8 minutes. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna go to a website that hopefully works well, and it's called menti.com. And on that website, you're gonna put in a code that's very tiny on that screen, yes? Okay, I'm gonna read it out loud. The code you're gonna put in, 61697797. And just knowing that not everyone likes to take the mic, some people like to more quietly contribute. Oh, hello. Okay. So what we're hoping now is folks will kind of plug in some answers here. And the question that we're really curious about, we've been talking a lot about the national housing strategy. We want to know what's actually working. What do we want to be promoted?
Can you read the code again?
Oh yeah, absolutely I can. 61697797. Ooh, these are good. Oh, these are good. Okay, my very favorite one, although I will say it's not, the community-based tenant initiative. Yes, Yes, was that you? Oh no. Sorry, don't tell them. That's right, because we don't have any more funding for tenant organizing. Folks might know it was one of the only programs in the National Housing Strategy that focused on existing housing. It was funding for tenant organizers. Funding for that expired in March of this year. Yeah, boo indeed. Yeah. Rapid Housing Initiative, yes, lots of support for Rapid Housing Initiative. Reaching home, yep. Non-market housing, safe housing for women, yep. I'm going to encourage folks, keep putting in your answers here. Maybe actually I'll see if we're getting, excuse me. Bring back CBTI, yes. Yes. I don't know if that's someone else involved in the National Right to Housing Network, but I'm going to choose to believe it isn't. More community land trusts, absolutely. We've got a lot of success stories, I think, about different community land trusts. Indigenous transitional housing models, yes. Yeah, to get some, to some extent, co-investment that is getting some new non-market housing going, that's true, but needs higher grants and more affordability and much faster approval and lower barriers, I hear, as well, to approvals. Yeah, oh my gosh, these are excellent. Reaching home, more funding though for reaching home, yep. Seed grants, yep. Oh my gosh, these are so good. Canada Housing Benefit, yeah, but a much better Canada Housing Benefit, I think, too, eh? For all households. Lived experience governance boards, these are fantastic ideas. Oh, I love, see, what a cool system, Mentimeter. This is me trying to prove to my comms friends that Mentimeter is cool. Okay, I'm gonna flip us to the next slide. Okay, and the next slide is this. And this is a really interesting question that we've kind of been grappling with in some of our right to housing spaces. And that's the fact that as we push for social housing, as we push for more non-market housing, as we push for more cooperative and public housing, the tenant protection piece can't be lost. Because the reality is some non-market housing providers are actually not great to tenants. And so we want to think a little bit about what does it take as we push for more non-market housing, what is it going to take to also make sure that that housing is good quality, that tenants' voices are heard, and that their rights are respected? Do you want to call these ones out, or do you want me to? No, you go. What's your vibe? Okay. All right. Equity-based, yep. For us, by us, yes. Gender-based analysis, that's right.
Ooh, on that point.
Yeah, you should do that.
No, just a reminder as well, we always try to plug it, I know Carolyn does as well, that in the National Housing Strategy, they committed to 25 to 33% of all funding dedicated to women and gender diverse folks. There's no way to tell if they are doing that, but I would say no, based on qualitative evidence. So something that folks should push in all of your advocacy as well. That's a great point.
Totally. I'm going to call out this point, building in tenant unions into all housing. There was a really great session in the best stream of the conference, the Right to Housing stream, yesterday. And we had an Indigenous housing circle come forward and talk about their tenant organizing. It was really powerful. But, again, I'll reiterate that all the federal funding for tenant organizing just disappeared in March. Okay, choice, autonomy, autonomy. Case by case, housing eviction prevention programs. We've heard, I think, a fair bit in this excellent stream about rent banks as well. Yeah. Accountability systems, access to justice. Yeah, how do you hold housing providers to account? And this has been a big issue too in some outside of market housing, that might not allow guests, for example. We hear a lot of critiques about that in the right to housing space as well. Wraparound support. Yeah, setting standards for what social housing could be. Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool.
Actually, another plug. Everything relates to Carolyn, but we did a report with Carolyn for the house about what the Housing Accelerator Fund should look like. And I think one cool recommendation that maybe we've lost is to require developers to put in some sort of human rights-based due diligence report. Like, have you assessed how this project will actually advance human rights? And I think that speaks a bit to that.
Yep. Yeah. Accessible legal representation for tenants to protect their rights. That's another one, that keeps coming up, like this legal aid concept. There's legal aid clinics in some areas. I'm very biased because I'm on the board of one, but I hear that they're at the highest capacity that they have ever been at in terms of clients coming and knocking on the door with housing issues. Really underfunded.
Is the report that Sahar mentioned publicly available?
Yes, but also I will put it on our website if it's not by next week.
Yes.
So check next week.
And our website is
Housingrights.ca.
oh gosh, you can tell Sahar and I are getting really punchy. Sorry, everybody. This is the energy. Okay.
Oh, and we should leave some time for Q&A.
Oh yeah, we should leave some time for Q&A. I think we've got about 5 minutes for any questions. Vicky! Yeah, can we get the mic over to Vicky? Are you and I facilitating questions, or is Jess?
No, that's just.
Oh, sweet.
We can just be here and hang out.
Just keep, yeah.
Thank you. One of the barriers to the right to housing, I think, right now, is the fact that certain governments, Nova Scotia, are trying to take a lot of the, let me rephrase, a lot of the housing accelerator fund is supposed to go to municipalities. There are governments right now, Nova Scotia, that once you take away housing from those municipalities, which would then not allow them to access this funding, how do we fight against that? Because right now, I know the municipality of Halifax is under attack from our provincial government in terms of housing.
That's open.
Take a crack at that. That is such an important question, and I'm based in Ontario. I'm based in Ontario, and the same thing is happening there. That I don't know how we fight against that, but I think if we're going to all do that thing that the morning presenter wanted us to do, of writing letters to our elected representatives, we need to add that to the list and make sure that the Housing Accelerator Fund actually, it results in net new affordable housing and isn't just used by provinces, territories, or even municipalities to just kind of backfill their own housing commitments. We really do need it to expand to housing.
Yeah, hi. So I work with a group of lived experts to try and help the Regional Waterloo and the City of Kitchener adopt a human rights-based approach. So we're always drawing upon your materials and materials of the Shift and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. But we come up with two consistent barriers, despite how lovely our social planners and urban planning teams we work with are. The first is that there is a significant portion of the population that is very committed to the dehumanization of people, and not just committed, but also committed to the extracting of wealth or the investing themselves off of having a portion of the population be in poverty. And then the other big barrier is that kind of discrimination is like codified in like, especially certain parts of the government. I don't know if you find this, like legal teams, health and safety, fire. For us, it's city managers. I don't know what it is at federal level, but are just like so codified in that. And this is where my question comes from. Because I'm just trying to figure out how do we move past this. It's a little bit spicy, so do not feel the need to answer. But I'm wondering if, like, does the framing of Canada's housing system or poverty system as apartheid or an apartheid-like structure, would that framing help us in trying to name that, just how systemic that hate is, how legislated that hate is, and allow us ways to try and disrupt it? I don't know. This is just me reaching into the box, trying to find ways to deal with that awful, awful hate.
I just want to build on that. I am not a legal expert, and I don't know what, is required to kind of constitute naming something apartheid. But I think your point is a really, really important one, that this is why we have to focus on systemic and structural level. We cannot solve the housing crisis one by one person at a time. And homelessness won't be solved by housing each person out of homelessness one by one at a time. And it's because we're in a housing system that is literally built on stolen land. That theft was achieved through law, so it's codified from the very, very beginning. It's built, as you rightly point out, on local laws and zoning, and also federal and provincial laws that deliberately marginalize Black communities, racialized communities, people with disabilities, and other groups. And there's a strong anti-poor bias that infuses laws around social assistance, for example, right? And that subjects people who rely on social assistance to real degradation and to violations of their human rights, to surveillance and control. So that is a really strong wind to push against. And I think the amount of influence that people in housing need have with regards to the housing system that they need to see is unfortunately really unbalanced, out of balance with the influence right now of those who are profiting from the way our current housing system operates. So we also need to make sure that we have real democratic representation, and that a human rights-based approach at its very base is about starting from the perspectives and from meaningful engagement with those who are in greatest need, to co-design policies and programs to ensure that they meet those needs. So that's a huge paradigm shift from Canada's colonial legacy. I think we can do it though.
I just want to quickly add, my dad was in South Africa in apartheid, and the blacks then called apartheid apartheid. And this is one of the problems, is our systems are very divisive. Yeah. And we need to value better together. Narcissistic systems, narcissism does not value mutual well-being. Mm-hmm. We need to value mutual well-being. We're in this together. No apartheid.
Or did you want to?
Carolyn. This does not directly relate to what you're saying, but I just want to name that as advocates in this sector, I have definitely noticed a shift where the narrative is all about increasing housing supply. And to your point, we're not talking about affordability half of the time. It's not profitable to create affordable housing, but if we just build more homes, maybe it will magically trickle down, and we know that that doesn't work. So not to say that apartheid, I can't speak to that language, but I will say that I see the dynamics, and the power dynamics are getting worse, frankly. It's becoming harder, to speak an alternative narrative. So I resonate with that.
We are at time. I hate to cut this short. Yeah, I actually.
The floor, there's so many bougie white people discussing something to say. Can I get the mic? Thanks. Thanks. I was trying to say this at another event during this conference. One of my goals of coming to this conference was to advocate for the development of a central intake system. So just a call line that could be used anywhere within Canada for folks to call if they're in need of housing or shelter support. I just got back with meeting someone from the NDP caucus here in Nova Scotia. They returned back 1,000 signatures that I submitted calling for this system here in Nova Scotia alone. So I'm actually kind of disgusted right now being from Nova Scotia and looking for support from the NDP here, because this is part of the accessibility piece. And the accessibility piece is part of the human rights approach to adequate housing. And so if part of this conference here, we're not talking about even developing the basic access to supports, then what are we talking about? Because anybody can call 911 if they're disturbed by a person who's homeless, but a person who's homeless doesn't have any place to call, So again, that's what I'm looking for here. I sent a message out to MP Sean Fraser. I CC'd the Prime Minister into that. So it's already in the government's hands. Like they had the idea. So why it is that we don't have this system already in place, again, like there's no reason for it. Reaching Home already supports these types of systems through HIPAA, through coordinated access systems. There's no reason why we can't have this system already, you know? And again, like if anyone here is from Nova Scotia, please get in touch with Gary Burrow and Lisa LaChance. I'm embarrassed right now to even say that they returned these petition forms, and their suggestion to me was that we don't have the infrastructure in place to support shelters right now. And that's the reason why they don't want to create this support line. But no place in Canada has the infrastructure to support people. Like, it's a housing crisis anywhere you go. So we need this accessibility piece. And like, if anyone in the conference here, you know, is you know, about that, like really about supporting people, I would ask you to just kind of get on board with that, because all I see is a bunch of people here just clapping themselves, patting themselves on the back, and not really doing anything.
That's where you're wrong, because Homeless Advocates Association in North Bay is trying to do something, and we have a plan in place.
I appreciate it, but
We haven't been able to present our plan.
We need this call line. Like, where's it at? Like,
Recreative communities is where it's at, folks. You buy farmland to put small modular housing units, green housing units that are safe and livable, that can be built anywhere, including in wetlands. That's what we have come up with.
people don't want to be criticized.
Using the main house as a central treatment and healing center to treat mental health as well as drug addiction, and using harm reduction. We figured out how to get people off the drugs and substances that they're using through normal homeopathic remedies.
What was that called again, so I can look it up?
Homeless Advocates Association.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone.